When the word Viking is uttered, it generally holds associations with bloodthirsty pagan berserkers devastating the coasts of Western Europe. But what if I told you there was a small Viking settlement in West Francia that bred some of the most incredible knights of the medieval period? This Norse colony on the edge of the known world would create kings in not just Western Europe, but across the Mediterranean and beyond. Men whose relatives still rule as monarchs today, over 1,000 years later. These unique warriors would also establish Crusader kingdoms of Christendom in the Holy Land and be mercenaries both for and against the Byzantine Holy Roman Empire. They were the most revered warriors of their age, a bloody hybrid of Viking aggression and conquest smelted in the fires of time with Frankish Catholicism and culture. The signs of their presence are found across all of Europe, within historical tapestries, writings and their grand architecture. Tales of their conquest stretch from the foggy shores of Ireland to Muslim-occupied Spain, northern Africa, and the Principality of Antioch in modern-day Turkey. Embers of the Past presents The Normans. Before we get into the video, I would just quickly like to thank everyone for the support on my last video. It was beautiful to see so many people interested in the topic and interacting with the video. It exceeded all of my expectations. I'm only a small channel that is just getting to grips with all involved in the video making process. I hope I can keep up with the content that you enjoy, and if you have an interest in exploring the lives and cultures that came before us, please subscribe to this channel and come along on this journey to explore the embers of the past. Thank you. In the year 911 AD, a meeting would take place that would shape the future of medieval Europe. A Viking warlord would meet a West Frankish king on the banks of the River Seine in northwest France. The Viking Rollo had been raiding Frankish land for decades, and after losing a battle to the Franks near the city of Chartres, he was beckoned to negotiate by the victorious but fed-up Frankish king. And so it was that this unlikely pair struck a deal. Charles, the simple as he was known, was only too aware of the danger a man in his position found himself in, trying to maintain a grasp on a fractious kingdom with dukes and relatives conspiring and plotting his downfall. When he did find the inclination to leave his bed of snakes, he was met by fleets of marauding pagans, sailing up and down his coasts and deep into Frankish river systems, devastating even the inner sanctums of his kingdom, a trend that had become only too familiar to Western Christendom at this time. And so, Charles proposed a deal for this pagan warlord. Rollo would be granted lands in this northern part of the kingdom. In exchange for his fiefdom, Rollo was asked to swear to fight on Charles's behalf against the kingdom's enemies, to lead no more incursions into Frankish territory, and to convert to Christianity. After brief consideration with his counterparts, Rollo was said to have found the terms favourable and accepted this agreement. Now all that was left was to ratify the pact. As the two forces came back together, a rider sped towards Charles, informing the king that the pagans were no longer happy with the previously agreed terms, and asked that their new kingdom stretch not from the Andelle to the sea, but from the Epte to the coast, another 50 kilometres of coastal land. Whether this was Rollo testing Charles's temperament and resolve, or a realisation he had not leveraged the bargaining power he held effectively enough, either way, Charles agreed to the terms. The 10th and 11th century chronicler Dodo of St. Quintin recounts the colourful tale of how this awkward clash of cultures began. I use colourful as an adjective to describe Dodo's writings quite deliberately. Rollo is said to have publicly placed his hands within those of Charles, a ritual act of homage from the Viking to the Frankish king, and no small feat. None of Rollo's forebearers had been willing to submit themselves in such a manner, but for the prize he was to receive, Rollo saw the trade as worthy and allowed his pride to take a seat behind practicality. Within reason, that is. For you see, the next stage of this ceremony would require the behemoth of a Viking warlord Rollo to kiss the foot of Charles. Practicality or not, the proud warlord with decades of raiding and pillaging under his belt was not willing to submit himself even for such a prize. So Rollo arranged a compromise, calling one of his warriors forward to take the burden of the task on his behalf. Even this though seemed too much for even your average Viking warrior. Rather than lowering himself into the filth to kiss another man's foot, he instead raised Charles's foot up into the air towards his mouth, pecking vaguely at it before allowing Charles to tumble backwards into the mud. And so the Treaty of Saint-Clair was concluded. The Western Franks now had a Viking kingdom within their midst. The power this emerging culture would cultivate across Europe could never have been imagined. All corners of the Mediterranean would soon be speaking of the men that would emerge from this unlikely deal. From the Treaty of Saint-Clair in 911 to the year 1066, Viking culture assimilated with Frankish, pagans became Christian, and those later Viking settlers who came in waves over the decades were integrated into this new culture. It seems after long ocean adventures and freezing Scandinavia, many Vikings just sought good lands to cultivate and a secure place to settle, and maybe the occasional chance to raid and pillage. The word Norman derives directly from Nortmani, or Northman, Norseman. The name that rings through history is as closely tied to their origins as you could ask. But if you were to see a Norman man living 150 years after the coming together of these great cultures, the Norseman would be hard to see in the Norman. The evolution of these people was an interesting one. Christianity took over the pagan population even as numbers grew. Vikings married into Frankish families, and so the lines between the cultures became blurred as generations passed. The Norman society as it evolved was far more Frankish than it was Viking by a wide margin. The Norsemen were the ones integrating into a much wider and larger population after all. But it is the way that this culture is influenced by its origins and its experiences that lends to the Norman success. For example, the politics of these fractious kingdoms was complex, and the Normans had to survive in a most unique situation. Not only was their leader a Viking in Frankish lands, governing over a mixed population who wanted to oust him, but even the lands allocated were given to Rollo strategically. Charles was not known as the Simple due to a lack of intelligence, but rather due to a harsh interpretation of the Latin simplex, meaning simple. But you see, to be a simple man is not always to be a stupid man. The lands that over the decades would take the shape of Normandy through treaties and battles were a turbulent canvas for the rise of a kingdom. Charles had offered Rollo this treaty not out of kindness, but to act as a sword and shield. Rollo would not only fight on the Frankish king's behalf against those who might wish to oust Charles, an act he engaged in more than once, not always in Charles's favour, but would also be a buffer between new Vikings, either battling with them and slowing their pushes inland, or helping them integrate into an evolving kingdom. The Normans were also given lands around and on what was one of Charles's biggest competitors' fiefdoms, giving both of the sides a new threat to contend with. The new Norman lands also bordered the Bretons, a Celtic population that had managed to keep a dividing line between them and full Frankish integration. But these Bretons were a thorn in the side of the Franks, launching raids and incursions into Frankish land. The Normans would now act as a buffer zone against these aggressive groups as well. This new society was almost doomed to fail before it had begun, just like the other Viking colonies that had been swallowed by their neighbours in this same time period. But it's exactly this that led to the Normans flourishing. Their religion and manner may have changed, but their love of war was no different. Their pride in dying on the battlefield had not eroded, nor their willingness to raid for spoils and loot. This society was warring consistently against its many neighbours, competing for territory and dealing with Vikings more than any other part of France, having slave cities and ports regularly used and populated by Vikings. The early Norman dukes even allowed Viking forces to launch invasions across the English Channel from its ports. This combination of the evolving Christian population with the constant battle and encounters with Vikings led to a fearless society that was forced to be less battle-weary than their neighbours. The Normans were created in an almost perfect experiment to cultivate a successful warrior culture. They were governed with extreme discipline and administrative effect. The Normans took the administrative side of their Frankish heritage and folded it into every element of life. The Normans were one of the most well-organised and regulated groups within the region. It can be seen through the massive amounts of churches and places of education that would start springing up at an astounding rate in the following years. They were incredible record keepers and populated the clergy as much as any long-established Christian kingdom. The Normans were always on their toes. A second Rollo was never far off the horizon, seeking to carve out his own kingdom in Norman land. And they did come. The Normans were not just left in peace to tend their lands, they fought tooth and nail. Rollo's son William would be assassinated during a meeting to broker peace by followers of the Count of Flanders, and new barbarian kings invaded their borders and attempted to establish their own power bases in Norman lands. Normandy was also known for its horse rearing, Lower Normandy having a perfect climate and soil to create horses that would be desired across France. This lent to their adoption of a heavy cavalry-based army. Another unique point sometimes overlooked that benefited this emerging society was the amount of Viking men that had arrived over the decades to settle. Since it was seen as a possibility to integrate successfully into the Frankish way of life in this hybrid Norman culture, many young men and old warriors alike flocked to the region. This meant there was an even larger pool of potential soldiers at their disposal, and a high number of young men eager for war. After William, son of Rollo's death, it was William's son Richard who helped truly secure the duchy. While integrating into the aristocracy of Frankish society, he also highlighted his Viking roots to the new settlers, enabling him to have a connection and a reputation among Scandinavians that held far more prestige than any other Frankish duke could manage, causing more warriors to flock to his cause. The result of such a strict administrative order, a well-trained and regulated military class of men who had become highly trained mounted cavalry, an extreme religious fervour and devotion to God, the constant rubbing up against neighbours and battling tooth and nail to even establish themselves, a flow of Viking invaders and settlers maintaining the Normans never become too comfortable or forget where their roots lay grounded. It was always inevitable these people would go on to leave their bloody mark on history. In 1066, when William the Conqueror invaded England, the Norman cultural form was complete, a Frankish society that had been forged through constant war, consistent waves of invaders, and the plotting of Frankish landholders and kings to destroy the infant duchy. It bred a resilient warrior class more disciplined and honed for war than any of their neighbours, priding themselves still on martial prowess and bravery. No longer did dying grant you access to the vaulted halls of Valhalla, but to the gates of heaven. The Norman dukes had poured huge funds into integration, giving vast wealth to the churches and distributing lands to great warriors to hold and rule. While the Franks warred between each other, the Normans consolidated their power base. They built a strictly ruled society that valued religion, education, and war. They transitioned from foot soldiers to highly trained and organised heavy cavalry. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, became William the Conqueror, invading England and killing Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. This would solidify Normans in history. This pious, sophisticated King of England and Duke of Normandy, a man who is related by blood to the monarch of England Charles III who reigns today, this man respected above all in the upper echelons of Christian life, was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, a pagan Viking warmonger. This is the basic evolution of the Normans, with William introducing the world to how the Normans had evolved such a powerful warrior culture, capable of invading countries and deposing kings, having a cross-sea empire bred through ambition and war. The Normans never lost their Viking longing for land and spoils or glory on the battlefield. Normandy was a small place for such a large male population of brave warriors, desperate to find their glory, much like their Viking forebears who had terrorized Europe. But what if I were to say 1066 was not when this power was truly unleashed on the world? What if I told you William and Europe had already seen this martial force in action? According to William of Malmesbury, the Duke of Normandy is said to have spoken of another Norman's conquests, saying, and I quote, that it would be a shame for him to be surpassed in strength and courage by a man of lesser birth. This gives you insight into William's mind, and just how competitive this society was. To prove themselves as warriors and conquerors, a man was only as good as his reputation and lands, these things in the Norman world being claimed through clever politicking and war. The man William spoke of had already carved off almost all of the southern peninsula of Italy as his own. This man was Robert Guiscard. The tales of these Normans are just too great to contain in one video. This was an introduction into the evolution of the society, but now I'd like to go into a few of the examples that just highlight how far their reach stretched. The world that the Normans encompassed was absolutely huge. From such a small duchy in France to do what they did is truly an absolute phenomenon. To exemplify this point, let us touch on some of our Mediterranean Norman friends. In the year 999 AD, 67 years before William even conquered England, Norman pilgrims returning from Jerusalem stopped in the port city of Salerno in southern Italy. While staying in the city, it was attacked by Saracen pirates. The native population of the city, too scared to offer battle, was stunned by the Normans' willingness to lead and desire to fight. After displaying their bravery, Prince Gumar III begged them to stay. The Normans, however, are said to have returned on their journey home, but telling the prince they were to inform their Norman brethren of the desire for such warriors in the Mediterranean. Within 50 years of this encounter, the Normans would not be soldiers, but dukes and lords. Robert Guiscard, who I'd mentioned earlier, as that man William could not see out achieve him, had carved out his own empire in southern Italy and was Lord of Sicily, officially recognised by the Holy Roman Emperor. I touch on this man due to his incredible achievements that exemplify the Norman story, his desire for conquest, spoils and reputation, a berserker-like will to fight and a fierce devotion to God. Some of the most radical crusaders of this time were Normans. Robert was known as the Terra Mundi, or the terror of the world. He would fight not only for, but also against the Byzantine Empire, even defeating Emperor Alexis I Comnenus at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, with a force including up to 1,500 of his highly effective Norman cavalry. But I mentioned Robert not just due to his achievements, but because, like speaking of how William the Conqueror was not the world's introduction to Normans, Robert was not even the first to introduce these Mediterranean kingdoms to the Normans' might. Robert was not even the first to introduce them to his family's might. Robert's family name is Hauteville, being born to a petty lord Tancred of Hauteville in northern Normandy. Men longed to prove themselves and claim glory on the battlefield, to adventure across new lands, maybe some parts of their Viking DNA shining through. Normandy was not large enough to accommodate all of these men, nor could the son of a petty lord carve out his own kingdom or even become known. So what were Tancred's trained, pious warrior sons to do? All 12 of them. Yes, 12 Norman soldiers destined to leave their mark on the world. Before Robert had ever got to Italy or Sicily, his older brothers William, Strongarm and Drogo had already distinguished themselves in battles against Greeks and become counts of Apulia and Calabria. William earned his epithet Strongarm after challenging the Emir of Syracuse during a siege and killing him in single combat. Incredible pieces of bravery like this that could define an entire man's life are littered throughout Norman history. In almost every kingdom they go into, these tales are everywhere, and these men are always waging and winning wars. The tales are truly endless. Robert Guiscard's nephew would become the first king of Sicily. But you see, it is not just linked to Italy and Sicily. One of the most important leaders of the First Crusade was Bohemond of Antioch, as he became known, ruler of one of the 4 Crusader kingdoms established in the Levant. But Bohemond was another Hauteville, son of Robert Guiscard, and a Norman, leading crusades with vast combined armies under his control against their Muslim foe. Pagan invaders they were, now on the forefront of the Crusades of Christendom. This is not the extent of their holy quests either though. With continuous involvement from Normans through all the Crusades, the Anglo-Norman king Richard the Lionheart played a huge part in the Third Crusade, the man hailing from the great Angevin Empire that from their base in England and Normandy had controlled more of France than the French king under Richard's father Henry II. Richard even conquered Cyprus in the Mediterranean, almost by accident during the Third Crusade. After a storm dispersed his large fleet in the Mediterranean, the leader of the island took some of the shipwrecked survivors hostage and tried to bargain. Richard instead unleashed his forces on the island, adding it to his kingdom and deposing their leader Isaac Comnenus. He would go on to sell the island to the Knights Templars, an important staging and trading post for Crusaders. The Normans considered themselves some of the most holy men in Christendom and took their faith very seriously. Their crusades in the Holy Land were not just about carving out kingdoms and wealth, but these were true believers in the faith. Their battles against Islam were not just limited to the Holy Land. Where there is war, you will find Normans. Where there is holy war, Normans will find you. The Normans first appeared in the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, in the early 1000s. At this point, over half of the region was under Muslim control, and the call for men willing to fight for their religion was sent out. Normans, as always, turned out in droves. The Norman knight Roger of Tonua arrived in Spain to help the northern Iberian states fight back. He was a vicious warrior and is associated with a story not to be forgotten. He gained the nickname the Moor Eater, Moors being the name given to the Muslims living in Spain, or as the Islamic region was known, Al-Andalus. Roger would line up the Saracen soldiers captured in battle the day before, preferably in view of other Saracen soldiers viewing from the fortifications that they were defending. After walking down the line, Robert would slice one of the men in two across the mid-region, picking up one half of the man and throwing him into a pot of boiling water, informing the Saracens that their dinner would be cooked shortly. He would then take the other half of the man and walk back to his tent, allowing the Saracens to use their imagination as to what Roger would do with his half of their compatriot. These men would then be released to tell their comrades of just how demonic these crusading Normans were, just in case some of them didn't have a good enough view of it from their ramparts. Norman tales and exploits are so widespread that they are impossible to ignore in European history, no matter where you look. For example, in the 1200s, the son of another Hauteville, Constance, Queen of Sicily, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, Germany, Italy, and Jerusalem. Frederick II ruled the Christian world, a member of the Norman aristocracy. Normans in just over 100 years had emerged from an unremarkable Viking colony set amongst warring factions, intended to be used until degraded and broken, a useful and necessary deal struck by a Frankish king, with no understanding that in the centuries to come, those same Norman rulers and direct descendants of Rollo would be claiming not just the dukedoms of Normandy, Brittany and Aquitaine, but from their thrones across the Channel, they would now seek to make themselves monarchs of France. Normans had an undeniable and unmatched ability to succeed through policy-making, politics and war. Paired together with an insatiable thirst for conquest and their bloody upbringing, the Normans had separated themselves. From Rollo to Roger Guiscard and beyond, their huge chapter in the annals of history is long, complex and illustrious. For now, that is where we leave our Norman story. I wanted to test the waters and see how this video was received by the most important people, you my viewers. I hope it lit a flame in some of you or at least entertained you. For this chapter though, the Normans are now confined to the embers of the past. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you.